We're going to go ahead and look at factoring today. These are the hints that, or the steps you need to follow for factoring. You always want to check for your GCF, which is your greatest common factor. After that, if it has two terms, step two terms, see if it's differences of squares, sum of cubes, or differences of cubes. If there's three terms, then you want to just do two parentheses side by side, kind of doing the unfoiling. If there's four terms, then you want to factor by grouping. Also, just as a quick review here the top one is how you factor differences of squares. Next one is how you factor differences of cubes. And the bottom one is how you factor sum of cubes. You should have seen these before in a prior math class, but they're here as a refresher for you. So our first step is always look at our greatest common factor. So as you look across here, you have three terms, uno, dos, tres. Is there any number you can take out of your 5, your 15, and your 10? Yes, and that's where we put a 5 in front. Then you look, do they have any variables that are all the same? Well, they all have a's. Notice we could take out an a to the first, an a squared, or an a cubed. You always take out the smaller exponent on your variable, so we're going to pull out an a to the first. Same type of thing here with your b's. Pull out a b to the first. You then got to ask yourself, okay, if 5ab times what would give me this first term? Well, you know, a 5 times a 2, and an a times it would have to be an a squared gives you your a cubed, and your b times another b gives you your b squared. So then you do the same thing. Your 5ab times what gives me this middle term? Well, you know, a 5 times a 3 gives you your 15. An a times an a gives you your a squared. A b times your, basically a 1 here, gives you your b up there. So we don't need any more b's down here. And you do the same thing on the second one. And on the third one here, all we need is just a b squared. Our 5ab times our b squared is this right here. Now, let's take a look at this. We always want to look for our greatest common factor, of which there's no numbers that go into all the terms, and they don't all have x's, so there is no greatest common factor. Since we have four terms, we need to factor by grouping. So we're going to look at the first two terms and say, okay, looking just at the first two terms, is there anything I can just pull out of the first two terms? Well, they both have an x squared that could come out. So we'll pull that x squared out. Then we'll go ahead and say, okay, well, what would we have left here? Well, x squared times what is x cubed? Well, that's just an x. And then x squared times what is a 5x squared? Well, that's your plus 5. And then you want to look at the last two. What can you pull out of the last two? Well, in this case, they're both even. They're both negative, so I'm going to pull out a negative 2. So negative 2 times what gives me my negative 2x, and that's just an x. And then negative 2 times what gives me my negative 10, and well, that's a plus 5. Now, when you're factoring by grouping, if both of your parentheses are the same, then you're on the right track. Well, before we do the next step here, let's go down and take a look at this. Suppose you were given this problem here and you were asked to factor it. Well, you'd pull out your greatest common factor. You'd pull your a out, and so you'd factor it into this here. Or if you had what we have on the bottom, an x squared times box minus the 2 times box, well, you'd pull out that common factor of box, and you'd be left with your x squared minus 2. Well, that's the same type of thing we have here. Our parenthesis is just like our greatest common factor was down here. Here we had an x squared box minus a 2 box. Here we have an x squared parenthesis minus a 2 parenthesis. So we're going to pull out our greatest common parenthesis, or greatest common factor, which is our parentheses here. That's just like what we had down here for our box that we pulled out. And then you got to ask yourself, okay, what do we have left? Well, if we take this right here times what would give me this? Well, that's just your x squared. In other words, your parentheses here, you're pulling down in front, and they're disappearing. And you're looking at what are you having left? Your x squared and a minus 2. And now we have it factored. Go ahead and pull out your greatest common factor here. You'll notice here it's an x times a y squared. There's no numbers in common. They all have x's. Remember to take the smaller exponent. They all have y's. Remember to take the smaller exponent. So you're going to have a 6 and an x cubed. This times what gives me this here? That's a 9x. This right here times this right here, it gives me this, and that's just a 1. Here, once again, we have 4 terms, but you still want to check for a greatest common factor. In this case, there is no greatest common factor. So you group them, you try the first two, try the last two. What can you pull out of the first two? An x squared. Well, you pull an x squared out of here, what are you left with? An x minus 3. What can you pull out of the last two? Well, we could pull out a 4. 4 times what gives me this up here? An x minus 3. If both parentheses are the same, you're on the right track. If the parentheses were not the same, then you'd have to try a different pair. Maybe the first and the last, and the middle two as a pair. Or another option would be the first and the third term as a pair, and then the second and the fourth term as a pair. But we don't need to do that since both parentheses are the same. Both parentheses are the same. We want to go ahead and basically pull out that common factor. So we're going to pull our parentheses out in front here. And then remember, when we pull that out, the parentheses disappear. What are you left with? You're left with an x squared, and you're left with your plus 4. So we want to go ahead and factor this. Well, there's no greatest common factor. You always want to check for that first. There's more than 2 terms, so we know it's not a special. There's 3 terms, so you want to do the 2 parentheses side by side. And well, what you end up putting right here has to multiply together to give you this. And what you end up putting here has to multiply together to give you this. Well, it's not too bad to get this first part, because there's only one way to get a 3. There's going to be a y in each one, because a y times a y is a y squared. The only way to get a 3 is with a 3 times a 1. Whether I put the 3 here and the 1 here doesn't make a difference. Then we have a minus 5. To get a minus 5, that can come from a minus 5 and a plus 1. Or you could have a plus 1 here and a minus 5 here. Or it could be a minus 1 and a plus 5. What we need to do now is to check our inner terms and our outer terms to see if we get this right here. Well, in this case, I would get a minus 5 here when I do this. And I would get a plus 3 here, which when I add those together gives me a minus 2y. And in this case, it just happened to work out the first time. Now, if it did not work out and give me my correct middle term, then I would try flip-flopping the 2 red ones around and checking my middle terms again. If that didn't work, I would then try switching my 2 signs around and see if I would get the correct middle term.